When Dorothy arrives at the Emerald City, she finds all her friends, but they've been turned to stone. They stand around the ruins of the Emerald City, their bodies lifeless. The city is abandoned, with only their bodies left grey and stoic. The Emerald City is a mausoleum, but it's not unoccupied. In one of the most terrifying moments of the film, we meet the living occupants of the city. It tumbles into view, moving on 4 legs, each leg ending in a screechy, rusty wheel. At first we see its face, a black, twisted mass of tissue and muscle, corrupted to a maniacal grin, eyes peering out with a cold, biting glare. Then it lifts its head up, revealing that the previous face was simply a false one, its true face hiding beneath. It laughs. "Come here!" it rasps in a guttural scream. It laughs and laughs. More of them appear, 3, 4, a whole gang. Dorothy flees and I would clutch my hand to my eyes, hoping to block them out and just make the nightmarish creatures go away. Dorothy finds, locked in an old chamber in the Emerald City, a mechanical guardian called Tick-Tock, who offers to protect her from the wheeled monsters. This creature has its own mechanical face, much like the one on the electric shock machine back in the hospital in Kansas. But it is Dorothy's friend, and it fights off the wheelers and discovers that the city has been taken over by an old witch called Mombi. Tick-Tock isn't terrifying. He's a friendly, amicable character. The same cannot be said for all of Dorothy's friends, but we'll get to that. First we need to talk about Mombi. I didn't recognise her as a child when I first watched the film, but Mombi was played by Jean Marsh, who also played the nurse that strapped Dorothy to a hospital bed at the start of the film, and who chased Dorothy into the river to meet her fate. She was, for 5 years, married to John Pertwee, the actor who famously portrayed the 3rd incarnation of Doctor Who, and, perhaps more relevant to this story, played the character of Worzel Gummidge, a scarecrow who was brought to life. I mention the scarecrow because Dorothy's other companions is a prisoner of Mombi's. When Mombi traps Dorothy in a tower, the young girl from Kansas meets one of Mombi's failed experiments, Jack Pumpkinhead. Jack is a terrifying creature, taller than any adult actor in the film, with stick-thin limbs which seem to go on forever. It stands unsteadily on elongated legs, wearing a tattered, old, discoloured coat. Its fingers ended in long, reaching branches. Atop its head sits a pumpkin, in the place of a head. When the creature moves, it does so in sharp and sudden jerks, pulling its hand along as if there were alien body parts. His voice is sickly sweet, provided by Brian Henson. Brian Henson is the son of the famous Jim Henson, and is now the chairman of the Jim Henson Company. His voice is certainly the softest part of an otherwise terrifying creature. If you've ever seen The Nightmare Before Christmas, you may find some very interesting similarities between the film's lead character. And at several points throughout the film, Jack's limbs would break and fall apart, having to be bound back in place with rope. Dorothy's only way to escape from Mombi's tower is to steal the powder of life, which the witch used to bring the pumpkin-headed creature to life. She stores the powder in a glass cabinet, along with her spare heads. Yes, Mombi has a collection of spare heads. She changes them to fit her mood. They sit in the cabinets, looking for all purpose to be asleep, but each head is very much alive. That night, when Dorothy attempts to steal the powder of life from the cabinet, she accidentally awakens one of the disembodied heads. Its eyes snap awake, and in a raspy voice it screams the girl's name. Dorothy Gale. The other heads awake and start to scream. They scream and screamed and screamed. Their echoing cries woke the witch herself, who rose from her bed, nightgown flowing like a spectre. the space on her shoulders where her head would be utterly vacant. A headless figure stumbling towards the young girl, arms outstretched, all the while her head screamed in terrible unison. We'd been in the city for a year. I'd been enrolled in a new school. It was far larger than I was accustomed to. And some of the boys at the start of the year had been brutally mocking. I was labelled as a farm boy and treated as an outsider. Over the course of the months, though, they had forgotten about my difference, and soon I was simply one of the other school kids. I'd seen him in the schoolyard. I didn't know his name, but he was a bright kid with a splash of sunlight blonde hair. I think he must have been about 11 years old, but to my young eyes he could have been older by an infinite number of years. He was a big kid. As a big kid, I tried to avoid him because he and his friends were loud and boisterous. He was in the upper years of school, and as a result, he didn't have to wear his school uniform. None of the upper years did, and so the big kid would wear whatever he wanted, usually a white t-shirt and jeans. I don't think he'd ever spoken to me. I barely even noticed him, but because of what happened, I remember him. It was summer. I was off school during the start of the summer holidays. It couldn't have been more than a week since school had stopped, and it was still a few more weeks before we were due to head away out to the seaside to spend our holiday in the sun. It was already a nice enough day. The sun was warm and there was a cool wind in the air. My mother had taken me into the city centre earlier that day, as she wanted to pick up a few items from the large post office where packages were sorted. I was feeling rather sour, as my mother's venture out to do the daily shopping had interrupted my time for watching morning cartoons. Nevertheless, I trudged along, on the promise that if I behaved, we could rent out a film from the video rental store that evening. It had been a long time since we had rented out Return to Oz, and the film had faded away from my memory. I was excited. I was keen to see what we could find in the dark little video rental store. My mother was certain that she wanted to rent out the Judy Garland musical version of Wizard of Oz and relive her love of the classic. This was years before blockbusters came here to England, and video rental stores were still small little stores owned by enterprising individuals looking to break into the new market. My mother parked a car just a few yards from the store, and we got out. The wind was starting to pick up, and it was starting to feel a little cold. I grabbed my coat from the seat of the car and pulled it on. My mother looked over to me and said, "I'm going to pop into the bakery for a moment." The bakery, I should mention, was on the street corner, 2 stores from the video rental shop, with a small barber shop between the two. "Wait here," she indicated in front of the video store. I waited. I wasn't going to argue, and I certainly wasn't going to disobey. The promise of watching a new film that evening was enough to ensure that. I waited for what felt like an age, but I'm sure it was no more than a minute, when I heard the shouts from the other side of the street. I looked over. It was the big kid, in his white t-shirt and jeans, his bright blonde hair shining especially bright in the summer sun. He was on a bicycle, along with 3 other friends. I recognized all of them from school, but just like the big kid, I didn't know their names. They were shouting to each other, circling around in their bikes, doing small tricks. One of the big kid's friends would make his bike hop back and forth. Another would swerve his front wheel, standing tall on the pedals. The road was quiet. After about a minute, the group moved onto the road, riding around the parked cars. It was a peaceful morning. About 11 o'clock, the boys were cheering. One of them made his bike hop onto the pavement, spinning the handlebars around as he did so. Not a single other sound broke the summer day. I watched the big kid and his friend doing their tricks for a moment, and they turned to look at the window of the video rental store. The window was full of posters, and I was curious to see what films they were advertising. I looked from one to another, barely noticing when the sunlight dimmed somewhat as a cloud passed in front of the sun. The next light brush of wind felt a bit colder, so I wrapped my arms around myself and waited for my mother, when I heard one of the big kid's friends cry out. The truck must have taken the turn onto the road too fast. I didn't see it turn, but when I heard the cry, I turned to look, and it was tearing down the road. It was a huge truck, massive, towering, and ferocious. Its carriages smashed into one of the cars on the far side of the road. The boys in the street started to turn and run, panicked in their steps. One dropped his bike and ran on his feet instead. The screams of the truck's brakes suffocating his own scream. The big kid didn't move. I don't know why he didn't move at the time. I realize now he was rooted to his spot by fear. His shirt whistled around him as he stared at the truck, eyes wide, mouth open, a scream echoing from his mouth. He tried to raise his hands to cover his face, as if his thin arms would defend him from the monolithic 10-wheeled truck that was charging out of control towards him. He was screaming and screaming and screaming. The truck bore down the street, and even though it was almost 30 foot from where I was standing, I felt the air hit me in a gust as it charged down on the big kid. The truck didn't even collide with him. It simply poured over where he stood, his body buckling underneath it, folding like it was made of paper. His head, at the height of the top of the wheels, was tore free. There wasn't much blood, but the force of the truck colliding with the big kid ripped the boy's head from his shoulders and sent it hurtling across the street. The big kid's head struck the road, and suddenly it was nothing more than a hunk of meat, like a prop in a movie. I wasn't screaming. I couldn't. My throat simply wouldn't make a sound, except for a series of wheezing gasps as I tried to pull enough air into my lungs. I couldn't scream because I couldn't breathe. But there was screaming in the air, and I couldn't figure out who was screaming. Then I realized it was the head. The big kid's head, swaying slightly as it lay on the road, in the gutter, emptying his last sounds from the ruins of his throat. An awful scream that rattled from the severed neck, just for a few short seconds. The truck had stopped where it was, its brakes bringing it to an all-too-late stop. But beneath its wheels, the big kid's body twitched for a few moments more, his arms playing out the last moments of his muscles' memory as he tried to feel around in the empty air above his shoulders. The witch kept a collection of heads. She changed them and would wear a different one depending on her mood. And after a few short, terrible seconds, the movement ceased and the screaming stopped. The big kid, who had been less than a minute before being a living person, was rendered into pieces of unmoving matter, human meat, broken apart and empty. My scene would push what I'd seen from my mind, but it wouldn't work. I closed my eyes, but the image didn't go away. I could still see the big kid's head, the side of his face ripped and caved inwards like a dessert bowl, his eyes in the wrong place and his mouth open as he let the fall of the last echoes of his scream. Dorothy, of course, had fled from the witch's twitching, lurching body and a collection of screeching heads. She had run away and escaped the horrors. I wasn't so lucky. Some things I couldn't escape from. They would hold me in place and exist in the space between the blinking of my eyes.